Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight we're going to drift back, way back, to a time when fun didn't mean Wi-Fi or TikTok or being yelled at by strangers in the comments section. It meant rocks, and maybe some sticks. So, if you've had a long day, grab something warm to sip, dim the lights, and get comfortable. We're going to take a very slow, meandering walk through the ancient world of childhood. A world where toys were carved by hand, dolls were made of mud or ivory, and games were somehow both innocent and terrifying. This is the story of what children played with before toys came with batteries or safety warnings. Let's start where so many things in human history start: ancient Egypt. Because, of course, the Egyptians were doing everything first, building pyramids, inventing eyeliner, and yes, making sure their kids had something to keep them quiet while they tried to appease Ra for another scorching day. Archaeologists have found toy animals with little wheels attached, designed so a child could pull them along with a string. Picture a toddler waddling down a dusty courtyard, dragging a tiny wooden hippopotamus on wheels. Adorable, right? Until you remember, this is ancient Egypt, the same place where children were also learning about embalming. Some toys were made of wood, others from baked clay. The rich kids, children of priests or nobles, had fancier things: ivory dolls with real hair, painted faces, and movable limbs. Basically, they were playing with the 1300 BC version of Barbie. The poorer kids, on the other hand, got whatever the mud could offer that day: clay balls, roughly shaped dolls, or bones from dinner, turned into little trinkets. It sounds bleak, but honestly, they probably had just as much fun. Kids have always had that uncanny ability to make anything a toy. Let's float up the Nile and move east to Mesopotamia, where civilization itself was just learning to stand upright without tripping over its own bureaucracy. There, children were given miniature versions of adult tools: tiny wagons, little chariots, and small animal figurines, because apparently, even 5,000 years ago, we wanted our kids to pretend to work. Mesopotamian kids were also fond of playing with marbles made from clay or polished stones. You could almost imagine a small crowd of them in the shadow of a ziggurat, flicking pebbles across the sand, while someone's mother shouted from a doorway that dinner was ready. Barley stew again, obviously. Now, as we slowly meander westward, we stumble into ancient Greece, where play took on a whole new meaning. Greek children were, as you might expect, raised in a society that was obsessed with competition. So even their games were a warm-up for adulthood. Little boys threw dice, played with knuckle bones, which were, yes, literally animal bones, and raced hoops through the streets. Girls had dolls made from clay or wax, dressed in miniature tunics, and sometimes adorned with tiny jewelry. And when a girl was about to get married, she would dedicate her childhood toys to the gods, often Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of young girls. It was a symbolic goodbye to childhood. Imagine being 13, nervously handing over your favorite doll to a temple priestess, thinking, "Okay, I guess I'm an adult now." Meanwhile, the boys were probably still trying to set something on fire. The Greeks also invented something called ephedrismos, a game in which one player carried another on their back while trying to hit a target with a pebble. It was part sport, part chaos, and probably a decent way to sprain an ankle. Of course, all of this was happening under the ever-watchful eye of adults, who even in 400 BC were muttering about kids these days. Let's wander a little north into the Roman world, where things get both familiar and slightly unhinged. Roman children played with many of the same toys we recognize today: dolls, balls, toy soldiers, spinning tops, and even yo-yo-like objects. Some had carved wooden wagons, others had crepundia, little charm necklaces with bells or trinkets, a mix of plaything and protective amulet. Rich Roman boys had miniature gladiator sets. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Tiny fighters carved from bronze or clay, locked in heroic battle on the marble floors of villas. It's darkly adorable. And Roman girls? They had dolls with articulated limbs, sometimes even made of ivory, and little wardrobes of doll-sized clothing. In fact, one Roman girl's doll was found buried with her, lovingly placed in her tomb, because apparently attachment issues transcend millennia. And just like the Greeks, Roman children also offered up their toys when they came of age. There was a real sense that playtime was sacred, not just frivolous. It marked the boundary between innocence and responsibility. Let's glide even farther east, to ancient China, where the concept of play blended beautifully with philosophy. Chinese children had toys made from bamboo, wood, or paper, spinning tops, kites, and carved animals. Kites, by the way, were not just for fun. They were believed to chase away bad luck and illness. So yes, every time a child ran through a field with a kite, they were technically performing a spiritual ritual, while also trying not to trip in the mud. There were also games that required incredible patience, like the early versions of checkers or strategy boards, precursors to Go. These weren't just games, they were training for the mind, because in ancient China, even fun had to be philosophically enriching. And then, of course, there were the paper toys. Delicate, fleeting, easily torn. Beautiful, but temporary. A poetic reflection of childhood itself. Now, if you're starting to feel like all ancient children lived some charming, sand-dusted version of Pinterest, well, not exactly. Let's remember, most children didn't have a lot of free time. They worked hard. If you were a peasant child in medieval Europe, you weren't out playing marbles all day. You were helping milk goats, fetch water, or collect firewood. Your toy might have been a stick you used to herd ducks, and your game might have been trying not to get yelled at by your parents for losing said ducks. But even then, play found a way. As the centuries moved forward, children began creating their own games. Tag, hide and seek, make-believe worlds. You could almost hear the echo of laughter across time, bouncing between the pyramids, the Parthenon, and the Roman baths. Because whether it was a carved doll, a bone die, or a handful of marbles, the essence of childhood play stayed the same. A little joy, a little imagination, and a temporary escape from the very serious business of being human. Let's float forward from here into the next part, where the medieval and Renaissance children pick up the story. Because as it turns out, even in a world of plague, war, and questionable hygiene, play never really disappeared. It just adapted. Medieval and Renaissance children at play. Welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've already outlasted at least half the people who tried to listen to medieval history after dark. Let's gently drift into the Middle Ages now, a time when fun was relative, soap was optional, and children somehow found ways to play between plagues, church bells, and chores. So picture a small medieval village, somewhere in England, France, or maybe Germany. It's the 1300s. The streets are muddy, the chickens are loud, and someone's baking something that smells slightly burnt. Somewhere in all of that, a group of kids are miraculously laughing. Their toys? Handmade, of course. The medieval equivalent of a DIY craft project, minus the glue gun. Wooden horses, rag dolls, and crude clay figures were common. If a family could spare some cloth scraps or a piece of twine, congratulations, you just made your child a toy. If not, there was always a stick. There's always a stick. Poorer children would make do with whatever they could find, stones, bones, or carved bits of wood. And because kids have never changed, they still competed, raced, and argued about who cheated. Games like Blind Man's Bluff and hopscotch were popular even then. Yes, really, humans have been jumping in numbered squares for almost 1,000 years. They also played a medieval version of tag, which, like most medieval things, occasionally got a little too violent. Of course, if you were a noble child, one of those lucky few whose parents owned actual land instead of just renting dirt, you had nicer toys. Ivory miniatures, wooden knights, or even little castles made to look like your family's estate. And if you were a prince or princess, your toys weren't just for fun. They were training tools. Miniature armor, small swords, and tiny horses. Because nothing says happy childhood like preparing for battle before you hit puberty. Now, let's float up the social ladder for a second. Royal children were rarely allowed to play freely. Their toys were chosen for them, approved by tutors, priests, and occasionally by royal decree. Fun, but educational. Because heaven forbid little Prince Edward waste time when he could be learning about moral virtue from a carved wooden saint. Still, even the highborn got bored. There are records of royal households complaining that young heirs were unsettled, mischievous, or overly fond of play. Translation, they were just kids who wanted to throw things. But what's fascinating is that across medieval Europe, play was seen as preparation for life. Boys' games mimicked work or warfare. Girls' play imitated domestic life, dressing dolls, cooking with mud, or weaving with scraps of wool. So yes, gender roles started early, very early. You can almost imagine a little girl playing house in a dirt courtyard while her brother tried to launch a chicken with a stick. Now, let's drift over to the Renaissance, a time when art, culture, and very complicated hats were making a comeback. Children during this era finally began to be seen as something slightly more than small adults, which was progress in a slow, Renaissance sort of way. Painters like Peter Bruegel started depicting children in art, not just as miniature grown-ups, but as actual kids playing. In one famous painting, Children's Games 1560, Bruegel shows over 200 children engaged in about 80 different games. Rolling hoops, playing leapfrog, blowing bubbles, wrestling, riding stick horses, spinning tops, you name it. It's chaotic, joyful, and a little bit grimy. Basically, a Renaissance playground. During this time, toys became a small industry of their own. Craftsmen made dolls, hobby horses, and even tiny musical instruments. If you were wealthy, you might buy imported toys from Germany or Italy, places famous for delicate craftsmanship and for charging way too much money. Dolls, especially, started becoming status symbols. The most prized ones were made of wax or wood, with intricate clothing, and sometimes disturbingly realistic glass eyes. Children adored them. Adults, maybe less so. There were even toy soldiers for boys, a nod to the Renaissance obsession with chivalry and valor. Because nothing says fun Saturday like staging an imaginary siege with wooden knights while your tutor lectures you about Cicero. And yet, most play was still improvised. A leather ball, a carved whistle, a handful of pebbles, these were enough to spark hours of amusement. Some of these games evolved into early sports. Medieval versions of football, for example, were basically large-scale riots disguised as recreation. One chronicler described a game in 1314 where men young and old fell upon one another, kicking the ball with their feet, and great injuries were done. So nothing's changed there. There were also board games. Chess, backgammon, and Nine Men's Morris. Those were the respectable games, the ones parents encouraged because they didn't involve bruises. Now, it's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as all darkness and hardship, but play was everywhere. It echoed through stone courtyards and dirt roads, across villages and castles alike. Children laughed, argued, cried, and started again, same as today. And while their toys may have been crude, they carried something universal, the spark of imagination that refused to die, no matter how grim the world looked outside. So as we gently move forward, let's float into the 17th and 18th centuries, the age of powdered wigs, candlelight, and wooden toy empires. Because while the adults were busy inventing class systems and revolutions, the children were quietly inventing childhood itself. Stay cozy. In Part 3, we'll drift through the Enlightenment and Victorian eras when toys went from handmade treasures to the beginnings of industrial magic. The Enlightenment and the birth of the modern toy. Hey again, still awake? If so, that's impressive. You've officially survived the medieval mud, the Renaissance dolls, and at least 3 centuries of improvised entertainment. Now let's quietly drift into a more polished world, the 17th and 18th centuries, when powdered wigs were taller than self-awareness and childhood was slowly becoming something society started to notice. By the Enlightenment, philosophers were writing long essays about human nature, education, and reason. And somewhere between all that overthinking, someone realized, hey, maybe children shouldn't just be tiny adults with smaller spoons. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance, in his famous work Émile, said children should learn through play and exploration. A radical idea at the time, that fun might actually be useful. Of course, this didn't mean everyone suddenly handed out toys and told kids to enjoy life. But it did mean that play started to be seen as a tool, not just a distraction. So while nobles still played dress-up with their miniature portraits, a new generation of toy makers began crafting objects meant to teach as well as entertain. Imagine a young boy in 1750 London, sitting by the hearth with a small wooden puzzle. He's learning about shapes, balance, and problem-solving, all while his governess pretends not to be bored out of her mind. These were the beginnings of educational toys: alphabet blocks, counting beads, spinning tops designed to teach motion. It was the era of curiosity, when people believed logic could fix everything, including children's behavior. So toy shops began appearing in cities like Paris and London. They were modest at first, shelves of dolls, drums, marbles, and miniature furniture. But to a child of the Enlightenment, it was paradise. The elite, as always, took things further. Rich families ordered luxury toys, handcrafted dolls from France dressed in real lace, or miniature carriages with working wheels. Boys received toy soldiers in elaborate uniforms, often modeled after real regiments. These toys weren't just fun, they were status symbols. Little reminders that even at playtime, class distinctions still mattered. A duchess's daughter might have a porcelain doll with silk gowns. A servant's daughter might have a cornhusk doll wrapped in rags. Both were children at play, but only one of them smelled like lavender and privilege. Still, playtime wasn't just about toys. Children sang rhymes, skipped ropes, played cards, and staged miniature theater shows in their homes. Games like hide-and-seek, cat's cradle, and jackstones spread across Europe, carried by sailors, merchants, and bored adults who refused to grow up. And while boys were encouraged to explore the world, girls were subtly prepared to manage it, one pretend teacup at a time. Tea sets became the fashionable toy for little girls of the upper class. They mimicked their mother's afternoon rituals, learning how to pour, serve, and make polite conversation, the earliest version of playing house. So yes, by 8 years old, some girls could already host a flawless imaginary tea party. The patriarchy started early, but at least the teapots were cute. Now, let's slowly drift into the Industrial Revolution. That roaring, steaming, soot-covered period where even toys got mechanized. The 19th century changed everything. Factories, cities, trains, and the idea that children might actually need time to be children. Mass production meant toys became cheaper. Suddenly, the middle class could afford things that used to belong only to the aristocracy. toy soldiers marched out of metal molds. Wooden horses rolled on little iron wheels. Dolls started to look unsettlingly lifelike, with glass eyes, wax heads, and hair made from, well, real hair. It was the golden age of craftsmanship and mild nightmare fuel. But perhaps the most important shift wasn't the toys themselves. It was the idea of childhood. The Victorians, despite being famously repressed, adored sentimentality. They saw children as symbols of innocence, pure, fragile, and in need of protection from the grim adult world. So, play became sacred. Middle-class families built nurseries filled with rocking horses, doll houses, and alphabet blocks. Books like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and The Water Babies reinforced the idea that childhood was a magical, self-contained world, one to be preserved as long as possible. And yes, they still made it weirdly moralizing. Every toy, story, and game was supposed to teach something. Even fun had to have a purpose. It was the Victorian way. Now, not every child got to enjoy this dreamy new version of childhood. In factories across England, thousands of children worked 12-hour shifts making the very toys they could never play with. Tiny hands stitched dolls, painted tin soldiers, and polished wood, all for other children to unwrap on Christmas morning. It's a bleak irony, isn't it? The industrial age gave birth to both the toy shop and the child laborer. But in the minds of reformers and writers, that contrast only strengthened the case for treating children differently. Play was freedom, and freedom, for once, was something even the upper classes couldn't hoard entirely. So, by the mid-1800s, childhood had finally been recognized, not as a nuisance or a training phase, but as its own little kingdom of imagination. There were still chores, of course, and rules and itchy woolen socks, but there was also laughter in the garden, tin whistles in the street, and dolls lined up neatly along the mantel. The world had changed, and children, for once, were allowed to change with it. As we drift deeper into this story, we'll float into part 4, where things start to look a little more familiar. The 20th century, when toys learned to talk, blink, roll, and occasionally explode. Stay comfortable. We're about to meet the modern toy box, from teddy bears to Game Boys. The Age of Invention, 20th Century Toys, and the Rise of Childhood Magic. Hey there, still with me? Good. That probably means you've already adjusted your pillow at least twice and are now emotionally committed to this oddly relaxing journey through 5,000 years of toy history. So let's float softly into the modern age, where toys stopped being hand-carved family heirlooms and started being mass-produced plastic miracles. The 20th century was basically childhood on caffeine. Electricity, marketing, and industrial design collided to create what we now recognize as the toy industry. And for the first time in history, toy companies weren't just selling to parents, they were selling directly to kids. But before Barbie, before Lego, before the explosion of tiny choking hazards, there was one soft, fuzzy friend that started it all: the teddy bear. The teddy bear's story began around 1902, and ironically, it wasn't invented for children at all. It came from politics. President Theodore Roosevelt, on a hunting trip, famously refused to shoot a captured bear cub. Newspapers loved it. Cartoonists turned it into a national headline. And two clever toy makers, one in America and one in Germany, turned it into profit. The teddy bear was born. Soft, lovable, slightly melancholic looking, the perfect symbol for a new, emotionally literate century. Children adored it, parents approved of it, and toy makers realized something powerful. Toys could sell dreams, not just distractions. The teddy bear wasn't a weapon, or a miniature adult tool, or a religious teaching device. It was comfort. For the first time, a toy existed purely to make a child feel safe. Meanwhile, construction toys were also having their own revolution. By the 1950s, the old porcelain faces of the Victorian era looked creepy. Kids didn't want fragile, glass-eyed dolls anymore. They wanted personality, something that looked alive, or at least had a wardrobe. Enter Barbie in 1959. Created by Ruth Handler, Barbie was modeled after a German adult gag doll, a detail toy companies quietly ignored for decades. But what mattered was her message. You could be anything. Astronaut, teacher, doctor, all with an unrealistic waistline and impeccable eyeliner. Barbie was a mirror of society, glamorous, aspirational, and a little bit delusional. But she changed everything. Suddenly, dolls weren't just about nurturing. They were about identity. Of course, Barbie also sparked endless debates about beauty standards and gender roles, but at least she got kids dreaming and shopping. Meanwhile, boys' toys went the opposite direction. Explosions, adventure, and noise. World War II had just ended, and the world was obsessed with machines, heroes, and power. Toy soldiers became plastic instead of metal. Model airplanes filled bedrooms. And then came G.I. Joe, the action figure, because apparently dull was too scary for boys. Released in 1964, G.I. Joe let kids reenact entire military campaigns on the living room floor. Each one had a different uniform, weapon, and mission. It was patriotism in toy form, and a massive commercial success. Ironically, while Barbie was teaching girls about fashion, Joe was teaching boys about combat logistics. But hey, progress comes in funny packages.
Then came television, the great hypnotizer of the modern world. By the 1960s and 70s, children weren't just playing with toys, they were watching them. Every cartoon became a potential toy line. Every toy line became a cartoon. He-Man, Transformers, My Little Pony, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the synergy was genius. Saturday mornings were a marketing event disguised as entertainment. Kids thought they were watching adventures. In reality, they were watching advertisements. Still, it was magical. The line between fantasy and merchandise completely vanished, and no one seemed to mind. But not everything was plastic warfare and pastel ponies. The 1960s also brought gentle, imaginative toys. Play-Doh for sculpting, Etch-a-Sketch for drawing, Easy Bake Oven for pretending to cook, or accidentally melting plastic cookies. And in a small factory in England, a rubber ball was injected with air pressure just right to bounce absurdly high. Thus was born the Super Ball, a marvel of physics and playground chaos. You could say the 20th century had it all: creativity, danger, consumerism, and just enough glitter to distract from existential dread. Then came the digital age. In the late 1970s and early 80s, toys learned to think, or at least beep. Simon, Speak and Spell, Tamagotchi, Game Boy, each one introduced kids to the idea that play could happen on a screen. No more splinters or sawdust, just buttons and pixels. Video games took over, first with Atari, then Nintendo, then PlayStation. Each generation of kids fell asleep to a different glowing rectangle. But interestingly, even as the toys became digital, their purpose stayed ancient. To escape boredom, to imagine control, to make sense of the world in miniature. Because whether it's a carved stick, a rag doll, or a Nintendo Switch, every toy is still doing the same thing, giving children the power adults always seem to take away. By the 1990s, toys had become global icons. Pokemon, Power Rangers, Beanie Babies, Furbies, collectible, tradable, slightly creepy. The toy industry had perfected the art of addiction. Scarcity, exclusivity, the illusion of limited edition, all things medieval merchants would have admired, had they not been too busy salting fish. The cycle continued. Invent, advertise, sell, repeat. And somehow, amid all the flashing lights and plastic wrappers, that same ancient rhythm persisted. A child, staring wide-eyed at a new toy, believing it was magic. So, as we quietly close this modern toy chest, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Across 10,000 years, human play evolved from sticks in the dirt to virtual worlds, but the essence never changed. We've always needed play to survive, to imagine better worlds, to practice emotions, to escape the dullness of reality. Children have always been the same, curious, chaotic, endlessly creative. It's the adults who keep changing the rules. Let's take a slow breath here, because in part 5, we'll drift into the softer side of this story. How toys don't just reflect history, they shape it. We'll talk about the psychology of play, nostalgia, and how the toys we loved as children quietly built the adults we became. Ready to float there next?
The secret life of play. Why toys mattered more than we ever realized. Hey again. Still awake? Impressive. You've made it through thousands of years of toys, dolls, marbles, and political bears. That's no small feat. So let's sink a little deeper now into the softer, quieter part of this story. The why behind the play. Because when you strip away all the glitter, wood shavings, and marketing slogans, toys have always been one thing: tiny, emotional training grounds. Every civilization, from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the plastic aisles of Walmart, has understood something fundamental. Children don't learn by lectures. They learn by pretending. Pretend war teaches courage and teamwork. Pretend cooking teaches care and responsibility. Pretend royalty teaches, well, mostly bad accents and entitlement, but still, imagination. Through play, kids process the chaos of the adult world. They rehearse emotions, they test limits, they simulate failure safely. When a medieval child played with a wooden knight, they weren't just having fun. They were preparing for adulthood in a society built on hierarchy, religion, and warfare. When a 1950s girl played with a Barbie, she wasn't just dressing a doll, she was rehearsing her role in a consumer-driven, post-war dream of femininity. And when a modern kid plays Minecraft, they're not wasting time. They're building, literally, an entire universe from imagination and logic. Every toy is a mirror. It shows what adults value and what they hope the next generation will become. Let's float for a moment through some quiet examples. In ancient Greece, small clay animals were often placed in children's graves. Not as morbid as it sounds. It was comfort. Parents believed those toys would keep the child company in the afterlife. The Greeks, being practical philosophers even in mourning, saw toys as symbols of eternal youth, proof that innocence deserved continuity even after death. In medieval Europe, spinning tops and hobby horses were as common as prayers. Monks actually debated whether play was sinful or divine. One 13th century theologian argued that laughter soothes the heart and keeps men from madness. A solid defense for hide and seek, really. Then, in Victorian times, toys became morality lessons. Every dollhouse had a tiny Bible. Every boy's toy chest had something vaguely militaristic. The message was clear: obey, aspire, and don't break the china. And in our century, toys became something else entirely: nostalgia machines. Adults now buy toys for themselves, not their kids. Collectors markets, retro remakes, limited editions, all designed to trigger that sweet, blurry comfort of childhood. Because somewhere between adult taxes and emotional burnout, we realized that playtime was the last place we ever felt pure curiosity without consequence. If you ever visit a toy museum, and yes, there are many, you'll notice something odd. No matter the era, toys have a strange melancholy about them. They look frozen mid-laughter, like relics of dreams that outgrew their dreamers. There's a cracked doll from 1890, a tin soldier missing one leg, a faded teddy bear with a stitched smile. And in each, you can almost feel the ghost of the child who loved it, their fingerprints still hidden in the dust. It's haunting, but in a gentle way, like seeing your own handwriting from when you were 6.
Toys also tell the story of human emotion better than any royal chronicle ever could. Historians love to study kings and wars, but the truth is, toys are emotional archaeology. They reveal what people felt, not just what they did. For instance, when archaeologists uncover a 3,000-year-old rattle carved with a mother's initials, they're not just holding an object, they're holding love. The universal wordless kind that connects every generation. When a Roman child scratched their name onto a wax doll, it wasn't vanity, it was identity, a declaration that I exist and this is mine. In that sense, play is one of the oldest human rights. Before philosophy, before politics, there was the simple joy of imagination. Now, if we step back again and think about toys as reflections of society, they're basically time capsules of our values and our anxieties. The Cold War brought nuclear toys and space race rockets. The environmental movement brought wooden eco-toys. The digital age brought AI companions and interactive plushies. Every decade projects its hopes and fears into its playthings, and each generation passes those lessons, often unknowingly, to the next. Here's something curious. Modern psychologists now say play is as essential as sleep or food for a developing mind. It improves memory, boosts empathy, builds problem-solving skills. Even adults benefit when we allow ourselves to play. We unlock creativity that stress usually kills. But somewhere along the way, adults decided play was childish. We traded imagination for efficiency. And then, decades later, we started paying for therapy to recover the joy we gave up. So really, kids might be the smartest ones in the room after all. You know, if ancient Egyptians could see us today, hunched over glowing rectangles, swiping virtual candies,
They'd probably laugh. Then again, they'd also understand, because at its core, play is timeless. It's the same spark that drove them to make spinning tops from palm wood, that drove medieval kids to carve dice from bone, that drove 1980s kids to collect neon plastic monsters. We've always needed a space where the rules bend, the stakes are low, and our imagination has the final say. And that space, whether it's a sand pit, a game console, or a dream, is what toys quietly give us. Now, let's pause here. Take a slow breath, because in part 6, we'll drift into the twilight of this story, where play meets memory. We'll talk about how the toys of the past still live quietly inside us, shaping who we are, how we love, and why nostalgia feels so strangely sacred. It'll be the last gentle chapter of this long, sleepy journey. So, dim the lights just a little more. We'll start that in a moment.
The nostalgia of play. Toys that never truly leave us. Hey, welcome back. Still with me? That's impressive. Most people would have dozed off somewhere between the Roman marbles and the Victorian dollhouses. But not you. You're clearly dedicated, or mildly hypnotized. Either way, we're here, at the final stretch of our quiet little expedition through childhood's oldest companions. So, let's talk about something soft and a little sad. Not the toy itself, but the feeling it leaves behind. Because when you think about it, toys don't really disappear from our lives. They just change shape. The teddy bear becomes a memory. The spinning top becomes a story. The video game becomes, well, a nostalgic playlist of beeps and pixels buried somewhere in your brain. We grow up, but our toys never do. Let's float back for a second to ancient Egypt, where children were often buried with their dolls. It wasn't just for comfort, it was legacy. Parents wanted the child to take joy into eternity. They believed play wasn't something you outgrow, it was something your soul carries forever. Fast forward a few thousand years, and you can still see that belief flickering in modern culture. Adults buy vintage toys for reasons they can't quite explain. A man in his 40s hunts down the exact action figure he lost as a kid, pays more for it now than it originally cost, just to hold it again. A woman keeps her childhood doll locked in a drawer, worn, slightly eerie, but irreplaceable. These objects aren't about plastic or paint anymore. They're emotional anchors, tiny artifacts of who we used to be, and maybe who we still are when no one's watching. There's something beautifully circular about that. As kids, we use toys to imagine adulthood. As adults, we use them to remember childhood. It's a trade, a quiet, lifelong loop of creation and memory. Anthropologists call it cultural continuity. Poets just call it nostalgia. But it's more than longing. It's recognition. When we see our old toys, we see ourselves before we were complicated, before the rent, before the heartbreaks, before the existential dread of Monday mornings. Just pure, unfiltered curiosity. The same spark that built pyramids, painted caves, and coded video games. It's humbling, really, to realize that the mind of a child playing with a stick and the mind of an adult building a skyscraper are powered by the same fuel, imagination. Let's wander briefly through some modern echoes of that timeless play. In Japan, there's a concept called natsukashi, a gentle longing for something that's gone, but still comforting to remember. You feel it when you open an old game console, or when you find your first notebook and see the clumsy handwriting that once felt perfect. In Europe, there are entire museums dedicated to toys where visitors walk in smiling and leave oddly quiet. Not sad, exactly, just heavy, with the realization that childhood isn't lost, only distant. And in Bangladesh, artisans still carve wooden birds and spinning tops by hand. They're sold on street corners, not as antiques, but as living reminders that simplicity still has power. You'll see a child spinning one, eyes wide with wonder, and next to him, a parent watching, remembering their own. It's like time folding in on itself. But perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is that play doesn't stop working just because we grow older. Every creative thing we do, every sketch, invention, joke, or plan is adult play. We've just disguised it with fancier words. Experimenting, innovating, problem-solving. It's all the same instinct that made a Roman child roll pebbles down a dirt hill for fun. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that we stop playing, it's that we forget to call it play. If you close your eyes now, go on, humor me, and think back to your own favorite childhood toy, what comes up? The texture? The smell of the plastic? The weight in your hand? It's not random. That toy was your first connection to the wider world, your first experiment with identity, comfort, and joy. You could probably still picture where it broke, or how it felt to lose it, because toys teach loss, too. The first heartbreak of childhood is usually when a toy goes missing. And though we cry, we learn something quietly profound, that memories last longer than things. As the centuries drift by, toys evolve. They light up, talk back, connect to Wi-Fi. But the essence stays the same. It's never really about the object. It's about what it awakens. That sense of control in a small world, of safety and imagination. Every generation rediscovers it in new forms. Maybe it's Lego now. Maybe it's digital pets, VR worlds, or AI companions. Different shapes, same purpose. To remind us that even when the real world feels too much, we still have the power to create another. So, as this quiet little journey closes, let's not think of toys as relics. Think of them as echoes, soft, persistent, and very much alive. They sit in boxes, in attics, in forgotten drawers, but they also sit inside us, whispering the same message they always did. Be curious. Be gentle. Don't forget to imagine. If you've made it this far, you've just listened to the story of thousands of years of laughter, wood, clay, string, and dreams. A history not of kings or wars, but of joy. The kind of joy that built civilizations quietly from the sandbox up. So wherever you are right now, in bed probably, half asleep, just remember, the world you live in today was once someone's toy. And everything you create tomorrow might just be a toy for someone else's imagination. Sweet dreams. The afterlife of toys, where play never ends. Hey, still awake? Or somewhere between dream and history? That's fine. That's where this story belongs. We've walked through dusty ruins, ancient kitchens, royal nurseries, and backyard dirt piles, all chasing the same question. What did children play with before the modern world took over? Now, let's drift one last time, not through centuries this time, but through meaning. Through what play became when childhood ended and history began remembering.
Because here's the quiet truth. Toys don't die. They just move to museums, attic boxes, and memory. Let's start with archaeologists, those patient dreamers with brushes and notebooks, kneeling in deserts and ruins. Every time they find a toy, a tiny doll's arm, a carved horse, a marble made from bone, the entire mood of the excavation shifts. Because while coins and weapons tell stories about power, toys tell stories about people. They reveal something warmer, quieter, a glimpse of love. Someone made that object, not for survival, not for trade, but to make a child smile. In a world of hardship and war, someone still thought this little one should laugh. That thought, preserved in clay or wood, is humanity's oldest act of hope. You can see it everywhere. In ancient Greece, small terracotta dolls called plongones were found in children's graves. Their arms sometimes detachable, their paint worn away by touch. In China, bamboo whistles shaped like birds, still faintly playable after 2,000 years. In Mesoamerica, clay figurines with spinning heads, painted with traces of blue pigment. Maybe the last toy of a child who never grew up. Each one is like a heartbeat frozen in time. Proof that joy existed even when everything else seemed unbearable. But toys also became symbols, long after they stopped being played with. Take the Victorians, for example. They loved to romanticize childhood. They filled their parlors with porcelain dolls, not for play, but display. Glass-eyed children staring out from shelves. Haunting, beautiful, untouchable. The dolls became metaphors. Childhood as innocence, innocence as luxury. A reminder of purity in a world increasingly filled with factories and smog. It's a little eerie, but also poetic, the way adults tried to preserve their own lost wonder by trapping it behind glass. And then, of course, came the Industrial Revolution, when play went global. For the first time, toys weren't made by mothers or local craftsmen, but by machines. Tin soldiers rolled off assembly lines. Rag dolls were stitched by hundreds of unseen hands. A single toy could travel across oceans and end up in a house where the child had never seen the place it came from. It sounds like progress, and it was, but something was lost too. Handmade toys carried fingerprints, quirks, imperfections. Machine-made toys carried efficiency, predictability, sameness. It's strange to think that a carved wooden horse from 500 BC feels more human than a blinking robot toy made last year. But maybe that's why collectors, museums, and even filmmakers keep going back, because imperfection feels alive. Let's float gently now into the modern age, where toys aren't just objects, but entire universes. We don't just play with figures anymore. We build worlds around them. Movies, games, franchises, whole industries of nostalgia. A piece of plastic can now represent a $1 billion empire. A plush creature can have its own theme park. A pixelated plumber becomes a national icon. Somewhere along the way, the toy stopped being small, but the emotion stayed exactly the same. That same spark that made a Sumerian child spin a clay ball is what makes a kid today tap on a glowing screen. Curiosity, delight, escape. Play has always been the quiet rebellion against the ordinary.
And yet, there's something bittersweet about it, isn't there? We grow up, we stop playing, and then one day we walk into a store, or a toy museum, or see a forgotten cartoon, and something inside us stirs. A memory so old it feels like it came from another life. Maybe it's the jingle of a toy you once loved. Maybe it's a shape your fingers still remember without thinking. That's when you realize play never really left. It just changed rooms. It's waiting in your creativity, in your humor, in the way you find comfort in small, silly things. You don't have to hold a toy to still be playing. You just have to imagine. And perhaps that's what ancient people knew all along. They didn't draw a line between play and life. Their games mimicked survival, hunting, cooking, building, exploring. Their toys weren't distractions, they were rehearsals for being human. Even now, that's true. Every puzzle solved, every sandbox game built, every doodle drawn. It's us, still practicing life. Over and over, patiently, curiously, joyfully. So let's end softly. Imagine all the toys of history sitting together. Clay rattles from Mesopotamia, wooden dolls from Greece, tin soldiers, rag bears, plastic dinosaurs, digital avatars, all lined up on an invisible shelf through time. Different shapes, same purpose. They're not relics of childhood. They're proof that humanity has always made time for joy, even when joy was hard to find. And maybe that's the real lesson of history's toys. We've been playing our way through existence since the beginning, building, imagining, pretending, until it all felt real enough to live in. So tonight, as the light fades, remember that the world itself is the biggest toy box we've ever had. And everything you create tomorrow, from a doodle to a dream, is still part of that same game. Sleep well, traveler. You've just spent 2 hours remembering what it means to play. Epilogue. The world falls quiet. The candles burn low now. The air feels heavier, softer. That kind of silence that hums between thoughts. You've drifted with me through thousands of years of laughter, clay, and tiny wooden horses, from forgotten villages to royal courts, from dirt floors to digital screens. And now, as the story exhales its last breath, the world feels smaller and older. Maybe you can still picture it. A child somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, sitting cross-legged beside a mud wall, spinning a clay ball between their palms. The sound of sandals scuffing dust. The faint chatter of goats in the distance. That's all. That was joy. And then, blink. Another time. A Roman girl braiding her doll's hair before being called to dinner. A Viking boy carving a horse out of driftwood, too rough to stand, but perfect in his eyes. A medieval child clutching a little bundle of rags stitched into a bear, smiling before sleep beside a smoky hearth. Centuries apart, but somehow the same heartbeat. Because play isn't just a pastime. It's the pulse of being alive. The reminder that even in hunger or cold or endless war, we made room for wonder. we found time to pretend. And maybe that's what saves us. Not our armies or empires or inventions, but our imagination. The quiet, stubborn part of us that keeps saying, "What if?" So, as you lie there, eyes heavy, lights fading, remember that the story doesn't really end here. The ancient clay toys are dust now. The wooden horses have crumbled. Even the teddy bears of yesterday have gone threadbare and soft. But the play continues. Every time a child builds a world from nothing, with sticks, pixels, paper, or stars, the story begins again. And in that moment, time folds. You, them, everyone, all playing together across centuries. So, rest easy. Let the noise of the world fade like the last echo of laughter down an ancient hallway. You've walked with history's children tonight. You've held their toys. You've heard their joy. And somewhere in the dust between time and dream, they're still there, smiling back. Sleep well, little historian. The story will wait until morning. It always does.